Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Anna Douglas, who is a medical student who has just passed all her finals. So it's fantastic news. And she will soon be a doctor come June, July time. Just to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and it will be sent out to you, including the slides, over the next week or so. If you've got any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. At the bottom of the screen. Any other issues, please do email info@themedicportal.com. If you also, we're going to have to stop dead on 7 o'clock. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to email to info@themedicportal.com. And I will stop talking. Thank you so much.
Happy to. So, hi everyone, lovely to meet you. My name's Anna, and as you know, I'm a final year medical student. So, I'll give you a whistle-stop tour essentially about the UCAT, what it consists of, and the different question types that you tend to see. So, first of all, this is a short welcome from the Medic Portal. So, the Medic Portal has been preparing our prospective medical students for many years now, and they've been doing UCAT prep successfully in several schools as well as privately online. They also help with other parts of the application process as well. So also considering, interview prep, application prep, that sort of thing. A bit about me as well. So I am a graduate entry medical student. So I essentially did a bit of research initially. I wanted to go into a research heavy field. So I did biomedical sciences at Newcastle. I felt that I still wanted to do some clinical work though, hence why I went to Warwick. And now I'm in my final year and hoping to specialize in ophthalmology. But we'll get there at some point. For now, I'm just going to start my foundation year rotations. But anyway, I've been doing tutoring with TMP for the past 2.5 years. So I've done several tuitions and courses. So I'm very familiar with the UCAT. In terms of the application date for this year, so the moment that booking opens for this test is on the 23rd of June. You can start, basically start taking a test from the 13th of July onwards, and then it finishes on the 16th of September. Now, what's very important to understand is that for this test, you are only allowed to take the UCAT once. You cannot sit it 2 times. I think some universities also have an issue if you sit it 2 times in the sense of you're automatically banned from their selection process. So what's very important to note with this exam is that if you do not feel ready, it's worth just paying a penalty fee to move the exam to a later date. It's worth the money because if you don't get a good result, we'll talk a bit about how the UCAT score works and how it can affect your application, but you want as a high of a score as possible. And some students do tend to choose to simply take the exam the following year. So again, be careful when you're choosing your date. Don't just go for the earliest date. Make sure that you have enough time to prepare. Now, what does the UCAT test involve? So it has about 4 sections, different amount of times allocated per section. Now, it seems with verbal reasoning, for instance, even though you have 22 minutes, in reality, you have about 30 seconds per question. With decision making, you get a bit more time, so that's about a minute per question. Quantitative reasoning averages at around 40 seconds per question. And finally, situational judgment. Theoretically, it's 40 seconds per question, but practically, you have actually a lot more time for that section. But overall, it is a very time pressured exam. So, what you need to learn in order to prepare for the UCAT is how to kind of solve these exercises quickly and efficiently. Very important. So compared to the years before, in 2025 and in 2026, there was no abstract reasoning. So this has been recently piloted. It's been taken out. And instead, some of the other sections have essentially been expanded. So when you are comparing your scores to the previous cohorts, bear in mind that you will have essentially around 900 points less compared to the previous cohorts. Okay. Now, what does verbal reasoning entail? So essentially, you tend to get a passage in which you need to answer different questions about. You don't get a lot of time to read the passage, and this is the section that students tend to struggle the most. And even if you look at the averages throughout the years, verbal reasoning tends to have the lowest average compared to all the other sections. Now, the passages, you can't really predict them. There's common tricks that they do tend to use. Um, no one's testing your outside knowledge for these, but essentially they want to see how quickly are you able to read and comprehend information strictly based on what that passage brings. So nothing that requires any outside knowledge at all. Outside knowledge does not help you in verbal reasoning. For example, I want you to give you 10 seconds to read through this, and then I would tell you how I would approach the question. So, with verbal reasoning questions, you do not have time to read the whole passage. And what we tend to do and we advise students to do is do something called targeted reading. So you only want to read what is essential to answering the question. And in doing so, you need to identify what we call keywords. Now, keywords are specific terms within the item. So, for instance, if you can see my mouse, specifically keywords within this item, American actress Meghan Markle married Harry in 2018. So what I mean by keywords, it means that they are words that are as specific to this statement as possible. So we're not going for the keyword that's most frequently seen throughout the passage. We're looking for the keyword that will get us to the right answer. So ideally, not mentioned as frequently throughout the passage. So in this case, we would be looking for something to do with Meghan Markle, and I also like using years. So for instance, 2018 would be a good one to spot. Now, as you would notice, there's no 2018, but you do see a 2011. And it tells you then that 7 years later, Harry married Meghan Markle. But what's very important in this statement is that they used the word actress, right? And if you identify Meghan Markle as a keyword, you will be reading the sentence before, which includes Meghan Markle. So you've got this sentence over here, the sentence including, and the sentence after. Now, nowhere in this paragraph and within those sentences we selected does it say that Meghan Markle is an American actress. They just mention that she's an American celebrity. So this is what's really important in terms of not bringing any outside knowledge. So be careful and you make sure you stick to whatever is mentioned within that passage. So because of this, because they've said American actress Meghan Markle married Harry in 2018, the answer would be I can't tell. Some would make the mistake and say it's true, but the correct answer is can't tell because there's nowhere within the passage where they state that Meghan Markle is an actress. Is everybody happy so far? I assume I don't see any questions with the chat, so I'll move on. But if there is any, please let me know. If there are any, please let me know. Now, quantitative reasoning. So essentially what they want to evaluate is that you are able to use basic numerical reasoning to solve problems, and they also want to see a bit of critical thinking on your end. So are you able to solve problems quickly and efficiently? One thing that's very important to note is that nobody is evaluating within this exam, they don't evaluate you showing your work. It's simply how quickly do you get to that answer as possible. And there's different tricks as well. Do you actually need to finish your calculation or by mid-calculation, can you tell from the options that you've got what could be a potential answer so you can start saving some time? Are there any ratios that you already know in your head and you don't necessarily need to plug into a calculator? These sort of things. So wherever you can, you need to start learning how to cut corners. Ideally, though, if you're struggling with maths, I'd want you to first practice the theory, get access to a question bank and do some exercises, see how long it's taking you, and then start doing that timed practice. So for instance, you could be given a problem over here, and what I tend to do with quantitative reasoning is a similar thing that I do with verbal reasoning. I prefer to read the question first of all, and then match up to what they are basically telling me over here. So they tell you that a widget is filled with this volume of water, And assuming the widget is held with the cylinder facing straight up, what percentage of the cylinder is filled water? We look here, they tell us what the physics widget consists of. So it's a hollow cube and a cylinder fused to the center of one of the sides, right? We know that the cylinder is open, so water can be filled into the cube through the cylinder. And they're asking you what percentage of the cylinder is filled water. Now remember, this can be an easy question, but in reality, you've got multiple steps that you need to go through, right? So it's kind of learning to appreciate how quickly can you go through this, because in reality, you've only got 40 seconds to do it, right? So the first thing to establish is the volume of the cube. So we know that that would be basically this value to the power of 3. We need to establish the volume of the cylinder, which would be essentially 3, which is the pi value that we used. 2.5, it's because we have 5 divided by 2 because we want to find out the radius. And then we are going to multiply that by 10, and you're going to get 187.5. So you need to learn many geometric formulae to, like, they're asking for some general GCSE level based stuff. It's not overly complicated. On our UCAT course, you will also get kind of like a cheat sheet that would include the formulae that are included within geometry. What do they want you to know, essentially? But you need to be comfortable with circles. You need to be comfortable with many other shapes as well. Areas and volumes are generally fair game. Right, so back to the problem itself. We've got the volume of the cube. We've got the volume of the cylinder. So we know that the total volume is this value, but we know that we have this amount of water within here, right? So if we subtract from this total volume, the volume of water, we know that we've got around 93.75 left. So then that out of how much the volume of cylinder remains is going to be 50%. So then we know that we know that 50% of the cylinder is filled with water. So again, they're easy questions, but when you're lacking time, it becomes a bit more difficult. So for instance, for some of these, maybe I would have considered, if I wasn't comfortable with geometry, I would have flagged and gone back to it at the end. But I think with practice, these should become questions that should become easier for you. So again, make sure you're comfortable with the theory, practice it, and then start applying some time pressure in order to see where can you cut corners, how can you improve. Okay, question banking. Question banking, decision making. So with decision making, there's different ways to assess this. They include a series of logical puzzles. They can include areas where they want you to evaluate arguments. They want you to they want you to know some basic statistics. These can be, I don't want to say slightly easier. These were some of my favorite types of questions when I did the exam. So it's easier to be prepared for these, and you've got a bit more time. You've got about maybe 1 minute per question. And what's important to know, and this applies actually to absolutely every single section, there are questions that are easier than others. They value the same amount of points. If you do the easy questions very, very quickly, so let's say under 30 seconds, that gives you more time for those harder questions where you know you're more likely to struggle. Also, with decision making, you need to be comfortable with Venn diagrams. And that also includes quantitative reasoning, but especially decision making. They love Venn diagrams. They love making you create Venn diagrams in order to get to a solution. They love they love giving you Venn diagrams and asking you to interpret it. So this is something that you need to be very comfortable with. Now, an example for a decision-making question. They can give you a question and ask you, select the strongest argument from the statements below. And it's important to understand, what does a strong argument look like? What does a weak argument look like? And what are the keywords to help you make a decision? And the key point that I want you to understand about evaluating arguments is that a strong argument is going to the premise directly links to the conclusion. So everything that they ask within the question, the answer is more or less likely to tick most, or if not, all the boxes. With a weak argument, that's something that tends to be almost like an opinion. It's made of a assumption and it sounds subjective. Most times it's easy to spot weak arguments, and you usually got very two clear options that are weak arguments, and you're usually stuck between two answers. And if you are stuck between two answers, I want you to choose the one that seems to be ticking all the boxes, so not just some. Or if you're not sure which one ticks more of the boxes compared to the other, which one seems to be a stronger argument. And again, remember, strong arguments have to be objective and they need to seem as if they're citing evidence, right? So, within this situation, to improve productivity, should the NHS make uniforms for all doctors? So, for instance, if let's say if we go for, let's say, C, no, as administrators feel it would be difficult to monitor and enforce. Does it answer anything to do with improving productivity? No. So that means automatically it is a weak argument. It is not linked at all to what they are actually querying. Yes, as surgeons already wear scrubs as uniforms. That's the answer in B. Again, completely unrelated. We're not interested. So really, we would be stuck between A and D. And in A, they say yes, as it might help motivate and put staff into a mindset of working. It does link to productivity, but the word might kind of gives it more of a leeway. So we have to compare between A and D. And D, again, seems to be more evidence-based because it talks about it being shown to be limited benefit and it directly answers the question. So D is a stronger argument than A because it directly links to the conclusion and it includes something regarding all the doctors. With A, it's something that might help motivate them, but it won't ensure improvement of productivity. Is everyone happy with this? So, with these types of questions, you will see them often. They are great questions to get within the exam because they are easy, so they're not made to be overly complicated. These should take you maybe under 30 seconds and would give you more time for those harder questions. So again, strong arguments are the premise is directly linked to the conclusion, and it kind of ticks off all the boxes that are raised within this particular question, okay? And if not all, most. For decision making. So this is another type of question within decision making. They love doing, and these are really nice questions. So they can, again, they ask you how many students at University B cannot speak two or more languages. And essentially what they tell you within here is they've got English speaking students, 5 different universities, and we're asked about other languages they can speak. They tell you the dash circle represents University A, the dash crescent represents University B, the rectangle represents Spanish, the cross represents German, and the parallelogram represents French, right? And they ask you how many students at University B cannot speak 2 or more languages. So again, we're doing targeted reading. We're focusing on what we need. We look straight at University B. So let's pretend that I didn't read this whole thing for you, right? But you would go straight to University B, which is this, and they're asking you how many students at University B cannot speak 2 or more languages. Now remember, they told you English speaking students, so we automatically know that everyone within here is English speaking already, right? So in order for them not to be, so we need to look for anywhere, we need to make sure we look for the space where there's no intercalation between shapes at all, right? Because then there would already be 2 or more people who can speak that particular language. And the only place would be right over here. So then the correct answer is 3. The great thing about this with these types of exercises is that you're more looking for something visual and it's something that you can do very quickly and very efficiently. So as long as you read the question carefully and you pick out from this whole scenario what you need, you can get to the answer quickly and focus on some of the harder questions. Now, with situational judgment, what they want to see is that you understand, you would understand what good practice entails. So in the sense of what would a safe and good medical student, or what would a safe and good doctor do? So they're not asking about anything particularly clinical, but they're evaluating, your honesty and integrity. How would you work within a team? Do you know when to prioritize within a team? They want to essentially evaluate the general principles that they mention within the good medical practice. So it might be worth, if you have the time, before sitting your exam and before you maybe start prep work, have a good look through the good medical practice and see what are the general principles that they're talking about. Nobody wants you to learn anything by heart. That's not the point. It's more of understanding the principles that they want to emphasize. This will be good for situational judgment, and it would also help you for interview preparation, having a good understanding of these and different scenarios that they can give you. So let's say, for instance, they want to evaluate your honesty and integrity. They won't obviously tell you that, but they can give you a scenario where, for instance, um, a patient is asking you for the results of the investigation. You say you're not, it's outside of your remit to tell them, but the action that they give you is that you tell them you can't give it to them because you don't have the results. Now, that is lying. Even though it seems to be protecting the patient and it's outside of your remit to tell the patient the results, the fact that you're lying to them would be something that would be voted as inappropriate. So any scenario where they talk about lying would be inappropriate. If it would have said, I can't tell you because it's outside of my remit, that would have been a completely different scenario, because that way you would have been telling the truth. But if you're lying about why you're not telling them the answer, again, this is kind of like your driving test. Anything to do with lying will be seen as something very, very inappropriate. Okay. And this, again, is reflected in many interview scenarios as well that you may receive. So, for instance, students who are maybe lying about having a particular disability in order to have extra time within an exam, these sort of things. Pressure and prioritization is also a common topic, and they often link it to teamwork. So, what they want to see is, if you are working within a team and you are struggling, have you attempted to prioritize before offloading and asking your teammates for help? These sort of things. So consider, what do you need? What are the qualities that you need to work well within a team? And before um, before starting to offload your tasks, have you shown a method of prioritization? And based on what are you prioritizing? They also like seeing your thought process, because you're going to prioritize based on urgency. And this is, again, something very relevant also for interviews, because you will be asked on the spot to do that. And the reason is, as a doctor, you will be asked to prioritize many tasks. You will be asking probably other colleagues for help, but first things first is you will have to learn how to prioritize and do some of the work first before starting to ask your colleagues for help. Again, there's more details on this on the website. And one thing that I do want to mention is that there is a free practice test on the website, and you get to have a sense of what it's like. You can Google free practice UCAT test to find it, or just search it on the Medic Portal website. Now, one thing I do want to mention, as we've covered most of the sections and then I'll start talking about scores, is that timing that I've shown you earlier. So, for instance, let me just go back and then I'll come back to this slide, but this is really important. So, whatever time you've got allocated for one section, you can't use any of the extra time left for a different section. So you only have 22 minutes for verbal reasoning, full stop. You only have 37 minutes for decision making, full stop. So this isn't a time that you could carry on for a different section. Or even if you finish, let's say, decision making early, you cannot go back to verbal reasoning and do a couple of the questions that you missed. So whatever time you have allocated for each section, that is it. So bear this in mind when you start prep. Okay. Now, how do the scores work? For the top three sections, they're going to be scored out of 900. Most people do not score 900, but with time, people have started to score higher and higher. So I would aim for a minimum of maybe, well, actually, a brilliant score would be maybe around 720 per section, let's say. And then with situational judgment, they give you a band from 1 to 4, And essentially, you want to be within band one. The band one is the best one. Band two is also okay. Band three and four are eh. Now, the issue is many universities use the situational judgment differently. And the reason is, for instance, some universities can say students who are within band three or below should not apply to this university because they will simply not be included within the selection process. So when you get your score, see how kind of that fits with the selection criteria for that particular university. Now, what is a good score? So online, actually on the UCAT scores, usually you can see the decile ranks from the previous year. And you can also, after you take your exam, put in your score after the ranks are out, and you can kind of see what decile you're in. Um, Bear in mind that before 2025, many of the scores had around extra 700, 800, 900 because that also included abstract reasoning. Abstract reasoning is now out, so it will be a bit different compared to what you will be seeing in 2025 and 2026. Usually with a TMP, people tend to score quite highly, so it's important to have access to a very good question bank. So the main thing that will get you a good score is the question bank. No matter how much tutoring you do, if you do not put the effort of getting access to a question bank and doing a question bank consistently, and kind of setting a goal as to how much you're going to do per day, you will not perform well. So this is more something to do with discipline. Now, in terms of SJT scores, most people tend to score within band one and band two. Band three and four really isn't something that can happen often. Some people tend to make mistakes on the day, and that's how they can start slipping. I personally think situational judgment is a lot of common sense thinking, but it also again looks back at those principles from the good medical practice. So if you bear those things in mind and bear some kind of general golden rules, like for instance, do not lie, always prioritize patient safety, always make sure you're working within team well and you're trying to prioritize your tasks. These sort of principles will get you far within the SJT. And because so many people score well, and sometimes you're not sure how universities are considering the SJT, to be honest, the better you score, the better in a better situation you'll be. Now, why is a high score important? So, medicine is very competitive. That's something that's very, very well known. Now, what's important to bear in mind is how universities tend to treat the UCAT score. Some universities like taking a value, the value of your UCAT score, they whack it on an Excel sheet, and then they start comparing you to all your other peers. So it doesn't matter, let's say, how well you've performed within your GCSE and what are your predicted A-level grades, or if, let's say, you're a graduate entry medical student, what are you predicted to graduate with? What they want, so let's say you pass the minimum academic requirements, you are then literally just ranked by your UCAT score. And for instance, Newcastle University is quite transparent about this. That's their process. I think many years ago, Manchester was also doing a similar thing. Other universities, let's say, they might not rank you strictly on your UCAT score, but they might allocate points. So, for instance, they can give a certain number of points for grades, and then they could allocate a certain number of points based off the decile that you find yourself in within the UCAT. Another thing that people can do is they apply a minimum cutoff score. So, for instance, some universities, such as University of Warwick, establish that you need to have more than the national average in verbal reasoning in order to apply. If you have anything below, no matter how high your UCAT score is, if your verbal reasoning score is below the national average, you cannot apply. So again, there can be cutoff scores like that per section, or some universities can establish a cutoff score in general. Again, they won't necessarily disclose it. You can simply compare it to the previous year and then kind of try to add maybe 30 or 40 points to it, because it's usually more likely that people in the following year will score higher than the people in the previous year. There are some, but very few, who don't look at the score at all. But there are so few of these that obviously the better you score, the higher chances that you can potentially score an interview at a good university. So that's why I always stress if you're not ready for the test, just take the penalty fee and move it to a later date. It's worth it because otherwise you'll either have to consider either reapplying if you don't really going to the university you want, or taking your chances of applying with a low score. And the reason why I'm asking you to consider reapplying or at least moving it to a later date is that some universities specifically tell you that you cannot apply to this cycle anymore. These might have changed throughout the years, but some universities can be very picky and they tell you that once you've been rejected, you cannot apply to the universities anymore to their specific university. So bear this in mind. Look at the selection criteria and look at what they say in regard to, not being able to reapply the following year if you were rejected. Okay, I think I've emphasized this point enough, but essentially, the higher the score, the higher chances you're going to get an interview, which gives you a higher chance to essentially get in. And what can sometimes happen is that if you have, let's say, an interview score that matches a different candidate, some universities may choose to simply use your UCAT score to kind of differentiate between you and another student, or they may be looking at grades. Again, it varies, but this is something to bear in mind. Now, how to get good. You need to learn common tricks and you need to learn the types of questions that they ask you within verbal reasoning. So, for instance, remember I was telling you about keywords. What they like to do with keywords is that they disperse it throughout the passage to make you read maybe, let's say, more than you would ideally want. But the point is, you want to spot where do you see the keywords within the passage, just in case the keyword later on within the paragraph denies anything that you found out within the first paragraph. So that's what we call dispersion, right? With quantitative reasoning, they want you to learn how to make quick calculations and save valuable minutes. You in the exam will get a calculator that is on your computer. It is not a physical calculator, and that calculator is very slow. So you would have to make sure you have a key called numlock turned on so you can input numbers, because otherwise the only way you could use the calculator is to use your mouse and click, and that is just a time waster. You do not have time for that. So you need to learn to get quick with that calculator, and you also need to get quick with mental maths because you want to use that calculator as little as possible. So you may maybe ideally just plug in some numbers that you've got in your head already so you can start speeding up that process. And again, also consider with quantitative reasoning, it's multiple choice. As you're finishing your calculation, you know, based off the answer that you seem to be getting to, can you already narrow down some of the options a bit quicker and then stick to an answer without finishing that calculation completely? Because again, you have to cut corners. Is there anywhere where you can, let's say, have a diagram and eyeball it? I know this all seems harder to describe because we're not going through every section in detail right now. I'm giving you an overview, but there are different question types which, if you learn, it's almost like a pattern recognition. If you learn what they ask of you, you can find strategies to kind of help learn how to answer these questions quickly and efficiently. With decision making, getting to grips with critical thinking. So we haven't had this question type, but what they like to do is give you logical puzzles, and those are all about being organized. As long as you learn an efficient way to write out whatever they are asking of you, you can get to the answer in less than a minute. If you learn how to use Venn diagrams, again, these tend to be a bit harder, but you can have some extra time for them if you learn how to evaluate arguments very quickly, and that is something that is very, very doable. If you are happy with your statistical knowledge, again, they're asking just some basic statistical knowledge. It's nothing overly complicated. Now, the main reason why people might miss a high score. So you may be struggling on the day because you're quite stressed. Many people do not sleep. On the other hand, though, you do have adrenaline on your side, but you are asked to do a lot of work and very quickly, and you simply feel as if you don't have enough time. And when that happens, you start making easy mistakes. So what's important to do is, again, Take some time before starting time to practice to learn the theory. So if you don't know any basic algebraic or geometric formulae, so for instance, they expect you to know areas and volumes. They expect you to know that, for instance, speed equals distance over time. Um, these sort of things. They expect you to know how to calculate an average, how to calculate a percentage change. If you don't know them, learn it, apply it on a question bank, and then start doing it under timed practice. Practicing with a question bank is the key to doing well within this exam, and consistency is going to reward you. Even if you do, let's say, 20 questions a day, that is still much, much better than someone taking a 3-day break and then coming back and doing loads of questions. Okay, so we talked about this, but again, the question banking is going to be the thing that gets you a high score. And what's ideal about question banking is that with many of the question banks available, you can prefer, let's say you're struggling with one particular section, you can choose to practice a particular section a bit more and try to get that time pressure element of it as well. But it's true. First, make sure you're getting kind of the right answers and that you understand the theory. And then once that happens and you've got an accuracy of, let's say, 80% in terms of answering the questions, you can start applying some time pressure there as well. Once you've started doing that, you can start including mocks. And the mocks that I would ideally do is, again, I would do all of them online. So online beats any textbook that you will have because it simply does not mimic the exam conditions that you will have. So the Medic portal does really, really good mocks. It includes the calculator as well that you would work with. It also includes the same screen that you would really have to work with in the sense of what are the shortcuts tend to work as well. So for instance, you would use Alt N to go to the next question, Alt P for the previous question. You can flag questions as well. So it gives you more exposure to the real thing. And if you do well with the mocks, with practice, you will end up also doing well with the official UCAT questions as well. Again, don't kill yourself and do who knows how many mocks per day. I would start with maybe one mock a week and then start increasing the pace. And then make sure you do the official UCAT questions and tests last because those are going to be the most reflective of what you may likely score. Now, this is something that tends to be discussed a lot and people have varying opinions. So this is kind of like a general ballpark. I think that as long as you don't leave it last minute and allocate enough time, you should perform well in the exam. So I would give it maybe 2 or 3 months. That should be enough in order to do well in the exam. Um, I know there's other medical students who say, for instance, oh, that they didn't give any time at all, they just took it as it was. I don't know why people say that. It's obviously a lie. I can promise you everybody prepares for this exam. So whoever's telling you that they're not practicing or that they don't have access to a question bank or they just did the UCAT official things, they're lying. Everybody's doing prep. If you want to get 10% off on all non-tutoring products, we also have this code available, and I'm happy to go back to any of the other slides if there's any questions. But that is mostly it from me.
Hi, Anna. I think there are some more in the Q&A chat coming through. Can you see that? You can either answer these live or type it back to them.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I thought you had access to them. Let me quickly. Oh, sorry. Okay. So with verbal reasoning, if we see a question we know the answer to from general knowledge, should we answer it and move on for time purposes? No. So with verbal reasoning, you're strictly sticking to whatever they mention within the passage. Never, ever, ever use outside knowledge at all. That's what's going to get you lower points. And what I mean is they try to trick you with things that, again, are general common knowledge. So for instance, who was the leader of the Nazi Party? Adolf Hitler. They might exchange that within the passage, but within the passage, if they don't specifically say that Adolf Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party, then you don't know that that was true. The same goes for, let's say, the President of the United States, right? So that's another frequent thing that people go for. Who is the current Prime Minister? So make sure and verify that within the passage, they actually state that fact. So do not base it off any outside knowledge. Do targeted reading, find those keywords, and then reference it back. I'm really sorry, I didn't realize there were so many Q&A questions. Do you get any paper to do working out in the exam? So within the exam, you will have access to a laminated booklet, but with that laminated booklet, you also get a permanent marker pen. Now, what you have to bear in mind is that some test centers choose to give you a limited number of laminated booklets. I would check with a test center before you sit the exam, in the sense of actually just before you start. So you know how much time, how much space you're allocating essentially for your decision making and for your quantitative reasoning questions, because that's where you'll use it the most. Um, but yes, that's what you get in terms of paper to do any sort of working out. The TMP is the medic portal. I'm not quite sure in terms of all the business sides, but essentially, I think I'm going to let you answer that part of the question because I'm not sure. Sorry. But the TMP represents the medic portal. Are there any patterns to the questions? For example, would the question to calculate volume be asked again, but with different values or shapes? Yes, there could be a completely different scenario, but in terms of geometry, they expect you to know the formulae well. Not necessarily that they would ask you again how much water fills this up specifically, but anything to do with geometry and algebra tends to, if you're asking about specific question types within quantitative reasoning, you can have specific, for instance, percentage change questions, you can have average questions, you can have tables and graphs. But in terms of geometry, those are a bit more general. They expect you to know the circle very well because that comes up again and again and again, and it's a very easy sort of question type to solve. But in terms of more specific geometrical question types, anything to do with formulae for areas or volumes is fair game. Are UCAT cutoffs clearly on the uni website and how they use them? For the year that you're applying to, no. They will likely show you for the year before. If we're talking about cutoffs for verbal reasoning, if they tell you about something being higher than the national average, then that is something that you can look up yourself. I think with how universities use the UCAT, some universities are more transparent than others. I think you can get a more direct answer when comparing to the more transparent universities. But obviously, all universities have to publish a selection criteria document, and you can find this on their own website. So have a look at that in detail and see how you can then compare with the scores that you have received. But they all state in general how they tend to use them. There are some universities, I don't want to name them, but there are some universities who say they have like more of a holistic manner. So with that one, with those that it's a bit less clear, for instance, how exactly they use it. But from trends that other maybe students have posted throughout the years with people plugging in their Excel sheets, so I'm sure you've seen student room pages and that sort of thing. The ones who tend to say they take a holistic approach do seem to put a significant amount of on UCAT scores because most people who get interviews have high UCAT scores. Which websites would you recommend to use and how exactly should you use them? So I would say make sure to use any question bank. So question banks are key. You could go for the medic portal if you run out of resources, although I doubt that, but if you run out of using any fully of run out of mocks to do and out of questions to do, you can also consider other question bank resources such as maybe Medify or MedEntry. But I would make sure to use the official UCAT resources last because those are the most um, exam-like questions you're going to get because those are the people who are at the end of the day making up that question bank from which you will be examined on. If I could go back to the SJT slide, um, what did you want me to show you on the SJT slide? I don't know if it's answered below. Dorita, if you want me, if you can plug in an answer as to what you wanted to see from the SJT slide, let me know, because I'm not sure. This person has Medentry and Medify and want to start using it now. How would you recommend you start if you were to use and spend an hour a day? What things would you focus on and what structure do you recommend? I honestly recommend doing a full mock first. I think of it as a diagnostic mock. See how much are you scoring at that moment in time and what seems to be your stronger or your weaker section and start from there. And I would ideally make a schedule. For instance, I would do maybe not more than two sections a day. So I would work on the weaker sections, or I would, let's say, after doing your mock, you've spent 2 hours on it, you have to review the answers as well. Don't do anything extra. Just note down where you have to improve. The next day, include one section you're good at and one section you're bad at. Start with a section you're bad at and kind of go through, if you think it's the theory that you've done wrongly, go through the theory again before you do any sort of timed practice. And then, because you need to keep your skills up with the section that you're good at, also do some timed practice for the good section. And then again, the next day, you will do the other two sections that you haven't touched on. And then you cycle through it again. And then once you do that, maybe for an entire week, take another mock and see how you're doing. But this is with the idea that you've started doing some timed practice on the sections that you weren't doing very well in. If you haven't started doing timed practice for the sections you weren't doing very well in, I would delay the second mock. Does that make sense? So you want to practice consistently and you want to practice effectively. You don't want to lose the skills in the sections that you're very good at, but you also need to do apply significant focus on the sections that you're bad at. I think that's the general best way. So on a day you're not taking a full mock, work on one section that you're good at and one section that you're bad at. And that can include doing just some basic theory and doing questions without time, and then or also maybe included time practice. And again, you can choose how many questions you can want to do within a section under time. And then once you're closer, because everybody gets more stressed as they're closer to the exam, you can also increase the amount of mocks you do per day. So maybe you could, sorry, not per day, do per week. So maybe you can start doing 2 per week, 3 per week, so on and so forth. What is SJT? SJT means situational judgment test. Oh wait, sorry, I've skipped a question. I have read the GMC guide for situational judgment, but I don't see much improvement yet and was wondering if you had any additional advice for tackling the section, looking out for key words. I think it's more of understanding the principles. So kind of try to assess, okay, from the scenario and from the action, what principle are they trying to assess? So with SJT, what you can do is you take the action that they've given you and you try to think, is this an overall positive or an overall negative answer? If it is an overall positive, you then have to start thinking, does it have any negative connotation to it at all? Or is there only positive things linked to it? If there's only positive things linked to it, it's a very appropriate thing to do. Any negative connotation, even though it's an overall positive action, bumps it down to appropriate but not ideal. If you have an overall negative question, not an overall negative answer, but it has some sort of positive connotation, you would say it's inappropriate but not awful. If you have an overall negative action that includes absolutely no positive consequences at all, that's going to be a very inappropriate thing to do. So if you're struggling with situational judgment, start kind of judging answers in this manner and it will get you on the right track. And this applies to almost any question type in situational judgment. So think, is the action overall positive or overall negative? And are there any positive or negative connotations related to them, depending on what you kind of trying to evaluate? So if the action is overall positive, any negative connotations at all? Or if the action is overall negative, are there any positive connotations to it at all? For many people, this might sound confusing, but if you start doing question banking and situational judgment, what I'm saying will start to make sense. Also, in terms of keywords you can look out for, you can look for general positive and general negative words. And what I mean by that is, you know, if they're talking about anything to do with shouting, yelling, abuse, anything that sounds very negative, then you're going to automatically go towards the more inappropriate sort of answers, right? So a very inappropriate thing to do or inappropriate but not awful. I hope this helps in terms of tackling SJT questions. To what extent do we need to memorize the good medical practice and how do you remember the key principles? No one's asking you to memorize them, but it's just generally they want to see that you are an empathetic person, that you're thinking of acting with honesty and integrity, that you are prioritizing patient confidentiality, that you're prioritizing resilience and self-development. So no one's asking you to recite those principles. That's not what they want from you. But essentially, if you are in a situational judgment question, oh, how should I put it? Any sort of basic good morals or good principles that you would associate with being a good human being are generally what they evaluate within situational judgment. And think of generally what a doctor has to do, right? So think of that if you're struggling to remember. A doctor has to be honest, a doctor has to act with integrity. You would expect a doctor to be empathetic to you and talking to you. And then try to envision, even when you see on those medical TV shows, what do doctors do? They have loads of things to do, so they start prioritizing. If they're struggling, even after they're prioritizing, they start asking for help from their colleagues. Um, in terms of confidentiality, they only break confidentiality under three conditions. So, for instance, if it's required by law, if the patient consents, or this is more likely to be an interview question, not something to worry about now, but in some conditions with STIs and that sort of thing, but don't worry about that now. So you want to make sure that you're not breaking confidentiality. You want to make sure you're being honest, you're acting with integrity, you're being empathetic. So these are good general moral principles that you would expect of a doctor. Will a recording of today's session be shared? I think you answered that, right?
Yes, it will be shared. It will be shared over the next week along with the slides.
Is essentially common sense for SJT. Combination of common sense, but also just some general principles. You're not going to lie, you're going to act with integrity. But also consider, for instance, and this can sometimes change the answer and bump your answer from your score from a band two to a band one, is who is that person that's doing the action? Because they always underline the person who's doing the action. So, for instance, an action may be more appropriate for a team leader to do than for a simple team member. So in the sense of that can make the difference between choosing a very appropriate thing to do or appropriate but not ideal. So bear in mind who that person is within that scenario. When do you think it is best to book your test, early on or later? I think that's very personal and that's strictly based on how you've prepared you feel. If you don't feel prepared, I would just take it later. If you feel you are going to struggle to take the exam later on in September because you've got too many deadlines coming up, in terms of like application deadlines and that sort of thing, you can take it earlier, but just make sure you allocate enough time for it. Does anyone have any other questions? I don't know if I can see anything in the chat. There's nothing in the chat.
Oh, the last one I have on here, I've said it was from Mina.
And yes,
Some
some
people
people
said
said that
that the
the
good
kids,
centers. Yeah.
do you practice up to the night before? So I would say book early if you want a later date. That's something that you can do. That's not an issue. So it's more of just booking it early. I wouldn't I'd say the night before I'd maybe lay off it a bit. So just maybe do something during the day, do a couple of questions on a section you're not very good at, combination of a section you're good at, and then let it be. It's not worth being exhausted before your exam. Is it bad to take the UCAT early as I don't necessarily have the time during the summer to practice? It depends how early. So it's more of how, if you want to take it relatively soon, so let's say, I don't know, early July, How much time will you have to practice in May and June? So make sure you allocate enough time. See what scores you're getting and compare it to what what people in the previous years got. If you think it's not a good enough score compared to that, then maybe I would try to delay it. If you're confident and happy to do it, then maybe book the exam then and go for it. But again, my advice is if you really want to take it um earlier, book the exam early, and then if you think you're struggling, just move it to a different day. You're allowed to do that. Oh, and also for people who have MacBooks, you have different shortcuts. So I would advise either using instead of Alt, maybe something like Control Command Shift. And if that doesn't work, I would advise just buying a cheap Bluetooth keyboard. It's honestly really good and will help for your exam prep. What is a good score to aim for when doing mocks? Again, always compare to what I would maybe aim to be within the top. Well, when I was doing it, I was aiming to be within the top 20% or top 10%. See what that score was last year, and then maybe add another 30 to it because that's always going to increase every year. When you first start doing mocks, your score will be poor. It's not the end of the world. It doesn't really matter how much you're getting when you just start. It's more of trying to improve and then seeing from there what you want to kind of go for. So I would maybe, in an ideal world, I'd say maybe after 2 weeks of practice, 3 weeks of practice, you would want to start maybe getting closer to 700. I would say 3 weeks in, I was starting to feel a bit happier in terms of my improvement. But you can see the improvement quite early on, to be fair, but I was just being a bit difficult.
Okay, should we give it one more minute? What do you think, Anna? Is that okay? And then we'll have a hard
Yeah,
stop at 7 o'clock, just in case
yeah,
any other
sure.
questions come through. If anyone does have any questions after this webinar, please feel free to email in at info@medicportal.com. Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I really, really hope this was helpful, and I wish you all the best of luck with your exam. And I hope you get the scores you want.
Okay, shall we call it there? Anna, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. Even I learned a lot and I work for the company separately at Dukes Plus, so it's really interesting. Thank you all so, so, so much. And we hope you have a lovely evening. We're going to log off now. Thank you.
Take care.